they're planting the garden. And this is what it looks like 1 year after. Now the thing I want to point out here is, so this was the existing vegetation. And because there was a lot going on, there's probably, 6 or 7 different species already here of things. In this particular rain garden, only a couple species were added because we didn't want to fight with the existing vegetation. It was tying it into what was already going on in the landscape. So there's just, some irises planted here, some of the native irises. And I honestly don't know what these are. I think they look like Artemisia, but I'm not sure what they are. But that's 1 year after planting, and just another view of what it looks like. And then this is year 2. So you can see it's starting to fill in more here. And you might even need to add a plant or 2. And that's pretty typical, but look at how well the irises have done. And also look at the overall view of how well this is still tied into what was already there. So I like to show that one because rain gardens can really vary from being, real diverse wild plants to having just a few simple species in them. Sometimes when I've worked with particularly businesses or government buildings or public places, depending on who's doing the maintenance, I'll try to keep the species list very simple. And also, for example, if different people are going to maintain it from year after year, I'll use more shrubs and grasses and less flowers because it's easy to tell non-desirable species, or what we call a weed, from a shrub, where it might be difficult to tell a weed from a desirable native flowering plant, especially when they're seedlings. So this is my favorite rain garden, and as if you can't tell. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that with the Shoreland Education Program at the University of Minnesota, we work with local governments, parks, citizens, neighborhoods, lake associations, in helping to do classes for the citizens and also the public officials in both how to draw your own landscape, how to install it, what kind of plants to use and where to get them, all that kind of things. It's covered in the Shoreland Buffers workshop, goes from like 1 to 2 days, and the rain garden workshop is about 3 hours. If we have a planting session, then that'll be additional. So typically what we do is we have in an area where we have a classroom section where people will come in and bring in ideas for their own landscapes, and we'll help folks with their own landscapes. And then also we'll have a planting session that goes along where we actually install a rain garden or a shoreland buffer, is the idea behind that. The last thing is on this slide, the other thing I want to point out about that is we also come back and do maintenance workshops and have maintenance tips for people, because on both shoreline buffers and rain gardens, a lot of times these are using types of plants that people aren't familiar with, and or maybe they're new to them. So we'll help them, especially in the springtime. It can be difficult to identify which of the plants you don't want to pull. I mean, you spent money to buy them last year, you don't want to pull them out this year. So my name again is Eleanor Burkett, that's me. I'm out of the Brainerd Regional Center, and my coworkers are Mary Blickenderfer, who's out of the Grand Rapids Regional Center, and Karen Terry. You want to raise your hand, Karen? And she's out of the Fergus Falls Regional Center. And so come downstairs, and we have more information on our program, as well as the handouts today. It was pretty basic today, but there is some, on each of the handouts, there's some good references there to give you more depth, as well as you can talk about having classes, and we can let you know where they're going to be this year. Is there a couple minutes for questions? Yes?
Eleanor, I saw your rain garden over at the Arboretum.
Yes.
In Brainerd. And talking with Jackie Freming, who helped you work on that, she told the story about how it worked with the workshop and the planting, and she said, allow plenty of time for planting, because when the workshop is over, you and Jackie were back to finish it up on Friday, I think. Anyway, putting in a new water feature above
Right.
the rain garden. And that might be a good place for someone who wants to see it, because it is a model. And we're making one out at the Long Lake Conservation Center starting in late May.
Great.
And we're using some of the examples that you put.
Yeah. I'm liking that one too. I'm from the Brainerd area, and there's an arboretum up there, and they are doing that. And I like the idea that they're going to have kind of up above, there's going to be a water garden, and then down below is a rain garden area.
We're putting in there right now, the rocks will be placed, the water will be flowing down the rocks and then pooling in the rain garden.
Well, I don't think so, to be honest, because I think that the idea of the water garden is to keep the water up there. The rain garden is more collecting water from the parking lot? Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, and so it's only going to be full when there's rain events. It's not, otherwise the pond would be constantly draining.
Now, will that handle a 3 or 4 inch event in 24 hours? Is that some of the design features that you...
That one, at that particular one, there would be, you know, I haven't seen it fill up. We haven't had that kind of rain.
We're in the process of designing now with our roof areas and figuring
Yeah.
out how much volume we need to contain.
You need to be sure and have an overflow, especially if you've got buildings around.
Yeah, we are designing an overflow at Long Lake.
Yeah, and if you're...
On a steep shore.
And the other thing I want to point out is the rain gardens here and the shoreline buffers here are pretty simple structures. I didn't do anything fancy with roads in this presentation, or buildings, or that, you know, like big churches or schools. You know, if you're doing, you know, depending on your situation, you need to bring in an engineer. If you need to look at the topography of the land and some of the engineering things, particularly with roads and parking lots and different things, I suggest people do work with engineering. And there's some... Yes. Yes, and we do use salt-tolerant plants, especially around parking lots and roads. Yep. Any other questions? Yes?
What's the, I suppose it's varies a lot, but what is the choice of the life expectancy of these sediments out there?
That's a really good question, is what's the life expectancy of these things before basically it fills up with sediments?
Yeah.
Okay.
We haven't had
That's a really good question, and the answer is it depends. Basically, the idea is, like in some of them, what we would do is if you have a lot of sediment coming in, like let's say from a parking lot or a road, you might have a pre-treatment catch basin that's going to get some of that big sediment out of there. If you have, I went to a rain garden workshop out at Rutgers University about a year ago, and my favorite talk was the one that failed. And it was a big parking lot rain garden in North Carolina, and it filled up with what we call fines, or really, really fine silt, and it failed within one rain event. And so, not, and they used, I think it was they used the wrong type of fabric to underneath the rain garden in that situation. But for the most part, I'm not talking about huge influxes of sediments in these. If you've got a lot of sediment coming in or coming off of a road or a parking lot, you need to have something in there to capture the sediment. Also, the other thing he talked about, salt-tolerant plants. One of the things I make people promise me is that they're not going to put their snow removal there for the winter, because that's filled with salt and stuff, and you know, those chlorides will absorb into the water, into the water table, and actually a lot of them are very soluble. I think we have one more question maybe, yeah? See.
Maintenance of the water gardens, if you have tall plants, do you need to go in there and in the fall take down stalks?
That's a good question too. The maintenance for the rain garden, you mean? Yeah, okay, the rain garden maintenance, typically I encourage people to leave the vegetation on the plants through the winter. And a reason for that is a lot of times the seed heads will help, will attract wildlife over the winter. As well as the vegetation, the dead vegetation will help hold the soil and the mulch in place. You can remove vegetation typically once in the spring. Maintenance does require at least one checking and cleaning up in the spring, you know, getting rid of, you know, McDonald's bags and cigarette butts, if, you know, depending on where you're at, and maybe some vegetation removal. And then also some weeding. So, and it just depends on how complicated or how many different species you have in there. So anyway, I probably better cut it off. I'll be around. I'm around here all the rest of the day today. And tomorrow morning we'll have our booth downstairs through 1 o'clock till tomorrow afternoon.